Thank you. Thank you. So good to see you all. This is the 13th session of this series. And this is the part where like things start to go down, not downhill, but things start to move fast at this part of the Lojong teachings. Like this is where we get paragraphs for each slogan. So we're going to kind of be trucking a little bit today. But I want to talk about a couple things first. And one of those things is to go back over something we talked about last week about ego and that teaching on like clarifying what we mean by ego and giving up ego. Um, but I'd like to start first with a short guided practice. I always like to share this because to me, this is a very grounded way, particularly during the day, to just check in with your state of being. And I just for me, I just call it a check-in. There are people that call this the window of tolerance practice, but for me, it's just a check-in because where it starts is a practice of just doing nothing. And I've been sort of jokingly, but not really jokingly, calling this the do nothing practice that illuminates dukkha. And I think the reason for that is because when we say do nothing, like let's try it for a second. Just do nothing. Don't meditate, just do nothing. That can be a tough practice for any number of reasons. And I think a lot of times what comes up are just these really like the kind of the, I don't know, the atomic little bits of dukkha, like what does he mean? Am I doing this right? How am I supposed to not meditate? Isn't meditating like everything? Like, am I just getting familiar? Like, just all these little things come up, and I think, in a way, it's sort of ego crying out for like something to do or play with, or something to grab onto, and that practice, I think, is a great starting point. And I think of the time when I heard, and I think he said this many times, but Kempo Carter Rinpoche suggested doing the flop. Has anybody heard about that practice before? It is basically just like if you need a way to kind of just take a break during your day that doesn't take long and you don't need nobody around you needs to know, you just let your mind flop. Like he said, like getting home after a long day at work, how you would flop down onto the couch. You just kind of let the mind flop. And you can do that, but you notice pretty quickly that like then a lot of times there's an inertia of like, well, okay, what now? Like, and I think we get that too sometimes when we get home after a long day of work. We flop down, and that first second there may be a real genuine exhale, but then we kind of say like, should I check my email? Maybe I should get on social media. Should I turn something on? Like there's just this momentum, and just getting familiar with that, I think, is really important. But this check-in practice starts with just doing nothing. And then what we're going to try to notice is in that state of doing nothing is what's arising, sort of spacious, dull, vague. Do we kind of sink in almost like downwards into like some sort of goo and kind of float and stop thinking and maybe even like dissociate a little bit? Or when we start to do nothing, do we start to think about stuff? Are we having thoughts? Are we starting to analyze? Are we evaluating? And it's always one direction or the other. It may be subtle, but it's always one or the other. And I think that's such a fundamental practice to start to check in on. Like, first of all, which side of that am I on? Am I more towards the torpor, dullness side of things, or am I more towards the excitement, agitation side of things? And if you can peg that, that's a fantastic start. But the next step here is to see if you can put like a value on it. Like we make it a spectrum from 1 to 10. And I was in a conversation with somebody about this the other day. Like, is it 1 to 10 or 0 to 10? Like, if we call 1 um, like dull, spaced out, and we call 10 agitated, like racing mind. Um, Initially, I was like, oh, it should be like 0 to 10. But the reason I don't like 0 to 10 is it makes 5 the middle. And then there's like a definite middle, and we can call it 5. And then we go, I got to figure it out. Done, you know? But like when we call it 1 to 10, then the middle is kind of, it's not a real number, you know? It's like something in the middle there. And I kind of like that. So when we do this practice, we do nothing, and then we just sort of notice what's happening. Is it more towards torpor and dullness? Is it more towards agitation? And then, like, where am I? You know, if 1 is the most spaced out and 10 is the most agitated, what value am I at here? And when I say most, I mean like most in your experience, you know, the most agitated you've ever been or the most spaced out you've ever been. And we just notice that. So, like, let's try that for a moment. So first, we'll just do nothing. And initially, you probably get a somewhat of an idea about which side of the spectrum you're on. And then see if you can give it a numerical value. Okay, thanks. So the main reason I always start with that, I've mentioned this in this group before. I'm a practicing Buddhist and meditator with lived experience of adverse effects of meditation, and I work with organizations with people who have, you know, a lot of those people have had adverse effects of meditation and serious adverse effects of meditation. So I want to make sure that you have some tool just so you kind of know how to assess, because we, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, we get a lot of admonitions about doing things always, you know, or never doing a thing. And I often point at Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche's excellent at the beginning description of the obstacles to meditation, and that's what I kind of want to highlight here. Is he says if you have torpor and you can't dispel it, you know, and or agitation and you can't dispel it, you should stop meditating, do something else. But then the very next paragraph says, when you sit down to meditate, if you have a plan for how long you're going to meditate, don't stop no matter what. So there's a little paradox there, and I think that's good. I think that's something else we'll talk about today. I think being in the space of paradox is being in the Dharma, really. When we think we've got it totally figured out and we have the answer that fits all the time, that's probably not the case. So with that in mind, and keeping in mind that idea about the ends of that spectrum, torpor and dullness, we're going to say the prayer of refuge. And I think that spectrum is reflected in the prayer of refuge because it has aspects that are very tightly focused and specific, like the 6 perfections. We want to accomplish the 6 perfections. That's something very specific and practical we're trying to do. And we want to do it for the benefit of all sentient beings. And I think being able to have that balance is really important, because there are so many times where the practical aspect may not be something we can accomplish in a certain situation, but we can lean back into that intention. And there are times where we need to go the other direction. Maybe we're just too spaced out. Just I'm a Buddhist. I want everybody to be Buddha, you know, and we're not actually making way for people in traffic, or, you know, being kind to the people we live with, you know, like, so there's all kinds of situations where we need to just know which side of that balance we're at so that we can correct a little bit. And so when we say this prayer of refuge, I think of this as like a prayer of balance. It has it built in right here in the second stanza, or what we would call like the 3rd and 4th line. So we'll say this once in English, once in Tibetan, and once more in English. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. O Sangye Chidam Suki Chogyam Trungpa Padu Dabni Kyapsu Chi Aki Jinso Ki Pe Sunam Ki Drola Penchir Sangye Drupasho. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of accomplishing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. I'll say a short prayer of my own. Paden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Daki Chibo Bedite Jula Patron Chimpo Bonichi Sunte Usun Tuki Mujab Sadhu So. Okay, so we had white smoke today. Everybody here? So I want to say something briefly about that because I think it's awesome. Just I always think when there's a new pope, it's exciting, and I got emotional like watching him speak. I was surprised how emotional I got seeing that moment of him walking out on the balcony, and um, and I was thinking about that process of the conclave. Like it's so fascinating, right? Like they take that oath and they go in secret and just really interesting. And I think it relates to what we're talking about today. And one of the threads I'd like to add to this rope of teachings, uh, which is a lot like what some of you may know as internal family systems. Has anybody heard of that before? So it's a style of therapy. It's what's neat about it is you can kind of do it to yourself. Like there are a lot of methods to even working yourself on IFS. And I just got introduced to it maybe 4 or 5 months ago through a program by David Treleaven, who wrote the book on trauma-informed mindfulness. And he was using it as a way to basically to serve people who are teaching others, either in meditation or Buddhism or things like that, because for especially for teachers, but everybody, of course, you have all these parts, you know. And if I just think of two of my parts, like there is definitely a part that is super anxious and wants people to understand what I'm saying or and think that I know what I'm talking about, you know. And then there's another part of me that's super confident and thinks like, you know what, as long as I'm authentic and myself and present, everything's going to be great. But those two parts are always in dialogue. They're always present. And it's not just those two parts. There's a whole lot of other parts. And we all have numerous parts. And so this IFS model kind of puts us into dialogue with our parts. You know, we want to kind of get to know them and listen to them. And there are parts of Trungpa's writing in this segment of the book, in this part of the Lojong teachings, where he talks pretty much about this, where he says, you know, get to know this part of you. I mean, it was before IFS was invented, but it's a similar kind of thing. And he makes the point, like IFS does, that all of our parts are fundamentally good. You know, even the parts that are anxious or get angry, there's some altruistic motivation in there, you know, that's maybe somehow distorted or not or being misapplied. And so the approach there is not to throw anything out. There's a saying like there are no bad parts. You know, all of your parts have something important to offer you. And that aligns, right, with our idea of fundamental goodness and Buddha nature, like and the tantric approach of like everything is brought to the path. You know, nothing is to be discarded. And this through the course of working with these teachings in this series, like it's become really apparent to me that that's kind of the most important takeaway for me is like, how do I eradicate ego and keep all this goodness? And I think I may have said this last time, but I feel like when the risk in like repudiating ego is really like friendly fire. Like there's a pretty good chance, you know, if we're not really careful about that approach of like repudiating the ego, if we're not clear on what we mean by ego, we could well be, you know, kind of like speaking ill to parts of us that have really important things to tell us. and that we can really learn from. And so I think it's really vital that we kind of think about those moments in our life where we consciously or unconsciously go into an internal conclave, with our parts, deciding who's going to be leading, who in this situation or who in this job is going to be the leader, and nobody outside knows what the dialogue is. And we may not even know, but it's happening, and we're selecting some part to kind of step up and be our representative at any given point in time. And we can have more awareness about that process. We can have more mindfulness about that process. We can have more intention about that process. And I think it really begins with honoring all of those parts, and just kind of knowing that that's a process that's always going on. And again, this is ways of thinking about and working with these important teachings about ego and what they really mean, especially to us. All Dharma is a remedy. I think this is worth taking reminder about, all Dharma is remedial. It exists, and we apply it in order to remediate our ego clinging, which is itself a form of imbalance. Clinging to ego is a form of imbalance. And the appearance of self and other, seeing those as real. And by doing that, we often lose sight of the actual situation, which is empty and luminous, vivid and insubstantial, wisdom and compassion, all the ways we talk about these two aspects of the actual non-dual situation. And again, it's non-dual, but it has two aspects. If you have, I think all of us have to have some little bit of like, what? When you hear that, because the only way we can talk about anything is with duality in our language. So, but these two things coexist, and they aren't in conflict with each other. And if it feels a little weird, a little bit like a paradox, that's actually the right place to be. So for many of us, that can feel weird, and like I said, that's okay. And a paradox is not a bad thing to feel. And the answer to that paradox is really only given moment to moment. There is no final answer. It's each moment we hopefully find an answer through curiosity and compassion. And the answers we find are never like a book answer, they're an experience in that moment that gives us the answer. Those answers are experiential. And that's another reason why it feels a little weird sometimes to be in that space. And the couple little, I'm going to jump around a little bit here in the beginning before we dive into the slogans. Another thing I want to share, I've been reading this great book called The Art of no, it's just called Quit. And it's like about the art of quitting by this author named Annie Duke. And it got me really thinking, because one of my favorite parts of the story of the life of the Buddha is when he takes the bowl of food from the little girl after he's been an ascetic for 6 years and is at the end of his rope, basically. And I feel like that is like one of the most beautiful moments. Like it makes me emotional just when I think about that. And so I want to share just briefly, just to touch on the life story of the Buddha. We have this one phase where we're told he's in the palace, he's living in luxury, he has everything he could want. In fact, his father's even like hiding anything that could hint at suffering at all. And he has this very luxurious, happy existence. And I think we all get excited a little bit, or at least I should speak for me. I get excited a little bit when I hear this story and I go, oh, but wait a minute. He saw the four sights, right? He learned like there's sickness and there's death. And he realizes like he can't go on like that. He has to find a path, that makes sickness and aging and death okay, and he sees the answer in the wandering yogi. And so he goes off and he cuts his hair and he gives up that life. He leaves that life behind. That segment of his life, he sets it aside entirely and goes full on to the other end of the spectrum. And now he's a full-on ascetic, and is the best ascetic. He's as good an ascetic as he was like a luxurious I don't know what you would call like a jet setter back in the day, but you know, he was a rich king who was enjoying all of the pleasures of life, and then he became equally as zealous about his asceticism. And I might be wrong about this, but I feel like this phase of his life is often held up as like better than the other one. And that's what I mean when I say I get excited, like, oh, now he's like learned, like he can't just be involved in his pleasures. He has to renounce, you know, and do this serious practice. And at least in my mind, I think I always kind of held this up as like a really important phase. I mean, they are both important, but I think I kind of like treated this as better than the luxury phase. But I don't think that's what the story of the life of the Buddha is telling us, because this phase had to come to an end too. This phase was not the path. It was not what he was seeking. And he discovered that. And like many of us have had to do in our lives, we come to points where you put a big investment into something. You've put lots of time and lots of care into something that you really, really believed in. Maybe you did it for really good reasons too. But sometimes we come to a juncture where we just recognize, I have to make a change, you know, and you accept the metaphorical bowl of food from the little girl and that period. And so we have these two parts of the Buddha's life, just like we have these two, what we call obstacles to meditation, torpor and agitation. And both of these phases of the Buddha's life had an end. And are taught to us as a parable about, so that we can learn the way of Dharma. Like, it's not just the phases, it's also the fact that these phases come to an end. And it was only through realizing that neither of those alone was the whole story. Like, neither of those was the answer on its own, that we ended up with the Buddha, that he found enlightenment. But I think, like, I had, these are AI images I had ChatGPT make. And I don't know if I've ever seen an image like this before, but this one made me feel happy. Right? I mean, we know even when we start on the path, there may be parts of us that are extreme, you know, or methods we used for years, habits that get a little out of control. But those parts have value. We need to confer with them. You know, we need to talk to them. We learn from them. We learn from the edges of the spectrum where the middle is. And so I think this also, again, relates right with what we were talking about the spectrum, right? Like, some days we're a little bit more towards that ascetic side of things, or some days we're a little bit more towards that luxury side of things. And just like neither luxury or asceticism is ever going to be fully gotten rid of, we're never going to totally be rid of, as long as we're on the path, torpor and agitation. And so I want to encourage you to kind of think about the ends of the spectrum as like the places where, like, the string is, you know, the end of the string on the guitar, right? Like, we're not ever going to just like take away excitement. Like, excitement is what the string's hung on, you know, like that's what it's set up on. And it's because we find the right tuning of that string, not too tight, not too loose, that it makes a sound. And the better we get at it, the more we're able to jam, right? So I want to share that, because I feel like that I talk a lot about this window of tolerance, you know, and I think that, I don't think I got there earlier, but if you're ever at a 1 or a 2 or a 9 or a 10, that's how you know if you should start or stop the practice you're doing. If you're sitting down and you're at a 9, you probably want to get up, take a walk, do something else. If you're at a 2 or a 1, you know, that's a good sign. That's your tell. You know, that's how you know this is time to try something else. So there is a way to figure that out. And this is one way. I'm sure there are other ways, but that's the way I would suggest. But in any case, we're always going to be balancing in this way. And if we know we're really far to one side, we can make better choices on how to bring things more back into balance. So with that said, let's jump into point 6, disciplines of mind training. And to look at this in the spectrum of the 6 transcendent virtues, or that framework, Trungpa points out that generosity and discipline are covered in point 2, patience in point 3, diligence in point 4, meditation in point 5, and wisdom in point 6. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but I know last time I talked a little bit about the ego, and I do want to just touch briefly on that again in terms of, because this also relates to what we've been talking about, which is the self-awareness and self-radiance as being the actual situation. And so we're going to talk about ego a lot today with these slogans. So we should know what's the mistake here. And that mistake is the self-awareness aspect, the emptiness aspect is mistaken as a self. And the self-radiance aspect is mistaken as an other. So that's the fundamental mistake. Like what is non-dual, but has these two aspects seemingly, is taken as two things. And we identify with one as being ourself, and we don't identify with the other. So we kind of, that begets duality. The Genesis chapter of the Book of Buddhism would be very short. So the issue here is that the key mistake is seeing these two qualities as separate things, dual or duality. And ego is what clings to that mistaken view. So ego is what, as Pema Chodron says, what resists what is. So what is a little tough, right, to handle, because it's this situation of non-dual that appears dual. And that like feels a little uncomfortable. Like I can't get my head around that. Like, oh, it's way easier to just think, oh, these are different things, you know, like, so I'll just stick with that idea. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about ego, is what clings to this mistaken view. It resists what is. And so how do we eradicate ego? I think a common mistake is we look at these two things and we go, all right, well, this is everything. Where do I find ego? And it can't be other, right? Like it has to be self-awareness. It has to be the self-aware aspect that's ego. You know, oh, that must be ego, because it couldn't be the other one, right? It can't be, our ego can't be somebody else, right? So I think the issue a lot of times is that we call our self-awareness ego, or the things that arise from our self-awareness, then we start to think of those as ego. And then we think like, I need to eradicate these or abandon these, or this is causing me all this problem. Or we start to talk to our self-awareness and tell it, you know, like, here you are again, you know, all the scripts that we find in Great Path of Awakening, which are useful. But if we're pointing them at our self-awareness, you know, at our goodness, that carries some risks. So the risk of that are, if we attempt to eradicate and abandon and ignore self-awareness and all its manifestations, that's not what we're trying to do, you know? So that's the first error that can happen in that approach. The second is we begin to understand ourselves even less. We're not paying attention to the very thing that gives us awareness of who we are and what we need, and whether we're moving towards dullness or towards agitation. We need that self-awareness. So that is, you know, when your mala gets caught on your Zen. Oh, there we go. Okay. It's got these like little things. They always get caught on there. Lama stuff. So we begin to understand ourselves even less. And then the third one is we end up strengthening the habit of ignorance, duality, kleshas, and karma, which we refer to as the 4 veils. So what is ego and what does it cling to? Ego is that which resists what is. So it's clinging to this idea of these things as separate, but what is just non-dual. So this is really important because there's so much talk, especially in these slogans, about ego. So to introduce point 6, Trungpa says, the paramita associated with the 6th point of mind training is prajna paramita. These slogans are all connected with sharpening your intelligence in order to work with yourself. This is the idea of a sword of praja. Praja is regarded as the sword that cuts the bondage of ego. The way to cut the bondage of ego in Mahayana practice is basically the same as in Vipassana practice. It is awareness relating to the rest of your world and to your life. It is connected with a larger sense of your entire life, and particularly with post-meditation experience. I'm going to read a little bit more, but I just want to point out here too that like, I want to get to this a little bit later as well. Post-meditation experience, that's most of our day, right? Like that's what I like to think of it as applied practice rather than like after a meditation. It's just applying what we do formally in our life. And so praja, he's pointing out here, is particularly related with that. And I also want to point out, because I always think it's super cool, the sword of praja, right? Like we talk about it as a double-edged sword. And I think what's super cool about it, right, is it cuts through ignorance. And when I first started learning about Buddhism, I used to call it like the sword that cuts through bullshit. This is awesome, you know? But what's really cool about it is like one side does that, the other side cuts through you. The other side cuts through your ego. So like while it's cutting through the crap, it's also cutting through the idea that there is any separation between self-awareness and self-radiance, that there is any duality. It's cutting that whole idea down. And that's why I think that sword is pretty great. So Trungpa goes on to say, whatever occurs in your life is governed by praja, which cuts through habitual and potential neurosis. Applying that tremendous sense of mindfulness and awareness comes from the great concentration that is developed through the bodhisattva path. With the help of the shamatha and vipassana principles, you learn how to consolidate yourself as a Mahayana practitioner, being in a state of compassion, kindness, openness, and gentleness. On the other hand, you are also in a state of egolessness. There is no clinging, no working or dwelling on anything connected with ego, Atman, or soul. When you're not dwelling on anything connected with ego, the activities described in the Lojong text begin to permeate your life. They begin to manifest. You realize that there is no I to meditate on, and for that matter, no I am to propagate your existence. Because of that, you're able to exchange yourself for others. By first becoming able to sacrifice yourself, you are able to overcome obstacles. Then you can relate to the rest of the world. In that way, you learn how to deal with your journey on the path by means of the sword of praja. And then we come to our first slogan, which is slogan 23, always abide by the 3 principles. And Trungpa, this is one of those, actually, this section of the book starts to diverge a lot from some of the more common texts that you may be familiar with, Great Path, Chogyam Rinpoche's Lojong text. These are definitely a different presentation. So he says, in terms of always abide by the 3 principles, this slogan is a general description as to how we can practice the Buddha Dharma according to the 3 basic principles of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. It is connected with a sense of keeping the discipline of all 3 yanas. Hinayana mindfulness practice, Mahayana benevolence, and Vajrayana crazy wisdom, all at the same time. And I want to read that last sentence one more time. It is connected with a sense of keeping the discipline of all 3 yanas, Hinayana mindfulness practice, Mahayana benevolence, and Vajrayana crazy wisdom, all at the same time. And what I want to highlight about this one is, it occurred to me this week, I don't know if anybody else has heard another teacher use this analogy, but I was thinking about the vehicles, and I was thinking about my own journey and how I had been so focused on Vajrayana and Mahayana learning. It wasn't until like quite recently that I started brushing up on my Hinayana. And and it's enriched so much of what my understanding of all of this. I think because I came into a center that our centers are all named the centers of three vehicles. That's what the names Karma Thegsum Chöling, Karma Chana, Dharma Chakra, they all mean like Dharma place of the three vehicles. But I think like the front page is usually Vajrayana, right? I mean, like what catches the eye is the meditational deities and all that kind of the ritual implements and stuff. And I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about, at least I hadn't heard a whole lot about the Hinayana side of things. And I also feel like I had a sense for a long time that like that I should maybe even stay away from it because I'm a Vajrayana practitioner, and there's something different about that Hinayana. I've probably told this story before because I love it, but Trungpa, he did this thing at a retreat at what's now the Drala Mountain Center. They go and camp and they would do this long retreat kind of practice every year. And he got everybody up at 2 a.m, had sent people out to go to their tents, woke them up out of their sleep in the middle of the night, had them come to the main teaching hall, sit down, and he gave them like a 1 sentence teaching. I think it's literally like 1 sentence, maybe two or three. But the teaching was never forget the Hinayana. Then you send them back to their tents. That's like that's a crazy story, right? And all to tell people don't ever forget the Hinayana. So like what occurred to me, this is what I was saying. I wonder if other teachers have said this. I was thinking if you're a Vajrayana practitioner, you need to know that you have a 3-car garage. Right? It's not like you switched out and got the Vajrayana vehicle. You got all 3 cars still, and you can pick, sometimes you need to pick which one it's going to be. Sometimes they're all together. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it. But like another thing that occurred to me is, recognizing ourselves as the deity and others as the deity. Have you ever noticed that like there's certain situations where that's easier to do than others? There's some situations where it is very hard to think of the other person as a deity. And maybe that's the day where you go to the Hinayana garage and take that car out for a spin, and just let go. Do the Hinayana approach of just letting go, abandoning. Or maybe you want the Mahayana vehicle and try to transform that. So I just want to make that quick point. I think that we all have a 3-car garage as long as we're Vajrayana practitioners, and we want to keep all those cars moving. You can't just let a car sit in the garage. You got to drive it sometimes. So slogan 24, change your attitude but remain neutral. Trungpa says, generally, our attitude is that we always want to protect our own territory first. We want to preserve our ground. Others come afterward. The point of this slogan is to change that attitude so that we actually reflect on others first and ourselves later. Then the slogan says, remain natural, which has a sense of relaxation. It means taming your basic being, taming your mind altogether so that you are not constantly pushing other people around. Instead, you take the opportunity to blame yourself. We are talking about changing your attitude of cherishing yourself. Instead of cherishing yourself, you cherish others. And then you just relax. That's it. It's very simple-minded. Slogan 25, don't talk about injured limbs. Trungpa says, because of your arrogance and your aggression, you prefer to talk about other people's defects as a way of building yourself up. The point of the slogan is not taking delight in somebody else's defects or injured limbs. Injured limbs refers very literally to people's psychological or physical state. This is not a puritanical approach to reality, but simply realizing that if a person has problems in dealing with his or her life, we do not have to exaggerate that by making remarks about it. We could simply go along with that person's problems. If somebody is completely freaked out and exaggerating his or her particular realm of phenomena, or freaked out about having an encounter with somebody, that is not regarded as an ugly manifestation of that person. It is just a general sense of his or her response to reality, which takes place all the time. Slogan 26 is don't ponder others. Trungpa says, I do not think there's very much difference between this slogan and the preceding one. They are basically saying the same thing. Both slogans are very simple and direct. All the slogans are points which come to you, not particularly traffic signs, but reminders. And each time a particular point occurs to you, the slogans as a whole become more meaningful. So this is pointing again at that idea of these slogans as like, once we train in them, they just appear to us like a road sign would appear on the road. And that's one of the reasons why I would suggest having some cards with these slogans on them and working with one each day. It's because it doesn't take long. It's not a big thing to add to your practice. Just kind of looking at a slogan, what it means, contemplate it for like a minute. Then those things start to really sink in, and then they're there. They move into like, I think what they call system two thinking in psychology, which is like, it's not like we have to search for it. It just comes. It's just naturally there. So, and I also think it's important with this one to highlight the difference between initial habitual thoughts and the thought that follows that, because so much of our thinking and responses are deeply habituated, over lifetimes. So I think if you have an initial thought, it's always, what do you do with that thought? That's where it really starts to count. We want to make it so our initial thought, our first thought, really is the best thought, and it is something that is beneficial to us and others. But I bring this up just because I think this is the kind of thing where if we get too far towards like the ascetics side of the Buddha's life story model, then we start to be hard on ourselves for that, but those things are going to happen, and it would be shocking if they didn't, right? Like we spent lifetimes with this stuff. So moving on to number 27, and I think this will be where we stop for today. Number 27 is work with the greatest defilements first. And Trungpa says you should work with whatever is your greatest obstacle first, whether it is aggression, passion, pride, arrogance, jealousy, or what have you. You should not just say, I will sit more first, and we'll deal with that later. Working with the greatest defilements means working with the highlights of your experience or your problems. You do not just want to work with the chicken shit, you want to work with the chicken itself. If we have philosophical, metaphysical, poetic, artistic, or technological hangups related with our particular neurosis, we should bring them out first rather than last. When we have a hangup, we should work with that hangup. It has been said that all Dharma should be applied in trying to tame it, but at the same time, we should not try to arrive at certain results. So the idea is to purify and to work on the highlights that come up rather than regarding them as junk. We simply work on any highlight or problem that comes up in our state of mind directly and straightforwardly. And this reminded me, it always reminds me, because it was the first book I read about this stuff, of Dharma paths and Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche's advice to make a list of our kleshas, or things we want to, that we hope to change, and then start with the most intense one. Start there. And it also aligns to kind of bring this back around. I mentioned that book, Quit, by Annie Duke. Part of the reason why I wanted to read that is I recognize how badly I have worked with the need to quit things over the years. Like I just have a string of stuff that when I look back on it, like I should have got out way earlier. I spent way too long in these situations and then for some reason didn't get out. And this book actually has a lot about the psychology of it. And it's interesting. I mean, it's one of those things where it makes sense sometimes why we stick around, because we put so much time into it. And even if it seems like it's not working out, we become more likely to want to stay. And so there is like a lot of science around this now. And so this book was useful for me because it taught me about that. It also gave me some really good metaphors to work with. And the one I want to share with you related to this slogan is about monkeys and pedestals. And so I will share my screen here. Oh, that's not the one. There we go. So the idea here is, if you have this great idea And this is somebody who has like an innovation lab came up with this analogy, and I've been loving it. And he said, maybe somebody gets this great idea. We can make all this money if we train a monkey to juggle fire while he stands on a pedestal. We can charge people all this money to come see this monkey standing on a pedestal juggling fire. And you go, great, okay, awesome idea. Well, how do we do it, right? Well, we think, what are our two pieces? We need to get a pedestal, so we'll need to build a pedestal, and we're going to need to train a monkey to juggle fire. So which one's harder, right? Like we know where pedestals are. We know we could build a pedestal. Like that's a very easy step. And so clearly we probably should start with training the monkey to juggle fire. That's really where we should put our energies, because we know we're going to be able to build that pedestal. That's not a problem. And so the reason I bring this up, and I want to give you a second to contemplate this, is because I think it's important that we know our monkeys and our pedestals. And know that when things get hard, it's frequently the case that we'll run for the pedestal, using the pedestal. Like, I'm going to work on the pedestal because this other thing seems big and too difficult. And we can spend so much of our time on the pedestals. And I've had this analogy for maybe 3 weeks now since I read the book, and it's helped me so much in so many different ways. Particularly was initially with my work, figuring out what the pedestals are and what the monkey is. And in particular, I'll tell you, like, for me, it was like I realized, like, I can do a talk or give a workshop. Like, that's the pedestal. The monkey is, how do you explain to people why suffering matters, or how do you get people to come and do the practice? That's the monkey to me. How do you make it personal, why we should be motivated to do these things? How can I get better at teaching that? Was one of my monkeys and pedestals. But the other thing I want to highlight is, I think, especially with a very ritual-based variety of Buddhism that we're in, I just want to warn that we don't make our practices and our rituals into the pedestals, or I mean, and they may end up being the pedestals because we do it every day. We know what the words are. We know what the visualization is. But if we're really setting out here to eradicate ego clinging, that's a big task, and there are a lot of subtasks involved too. But I know for me, the monkey is not sitting down and meditating. The monkey is in the post meditation. The monkey is in the applied practice. The monkey is very, what looks like, I mean, I don't think this is the case, but it's sort of a non-Buddhist-y stuff, right? It's like the stuff that seemingly doesn't, is not a Buddhist practice. It's just life, and it's human interactions, and it's my responses to things that happen in the world. Those types of things are the monkey for me, and I think it's easy sometimes to just start to feel good about all the pedestals we're building each morning on the cushion. I mean, I know there have been times in my life where getting on the cushion has been the monkey. So that may be the case for some of you here today, and that's valid too. So I'm not telling you what your pedestals or your monkeys are, but I'm just saying, like, it's something to really contemplate, not just in terms of work and personal life, but in terms of your practice. Because this slogan that we're closing with here for today about work with the greatest defilements first, I think this is a train that monkey first slogan. So I think that's where we'll stop for today. But I would open it up to any thoughts or any questions.
Lama, I have a couple things.
Yeah.
One is, I just posted a link. You can buy Pema Chodron's mind training slogan cards used on Amazon for a few bucks. They're really nice.
Nice.
Yeah, she calls it compassion cards.
Cool. Yeah, and I think they're also really easy if you want to just make them on index cards.
Yeah.
That's another option too. I always try to, on mine, I have the front is the slogan, and then the back I have like, if there's another translation of the slogan that's meaningful to me, and also like relevant stuff about, there's some of these slogans like the one about like, always remember the two things or something. And it's like, well, what are the two things? So you can put that on the back of the card. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that practice with the cards, it's so nice. And it's like, I love it because it's like a random, in a way, aspect of my practice. Like I never know what card's going to come up. So it's sort of like this fluid aspect of what can be somewhat repetitive in terms of like activity. So that's another reason I would recommend working with cards.
So
Daniel, you had other things? Yeah.
yeah, one other thing about sitting practice. And I think Kempo Karchar one time said, don't sit so long that your meditation starts to degrade. Like you get too impatient or bored or whatever. Yet at the same time, we should be sitting long enough to be, get off the cushion and be more relaxed and refreshed throughout the day, no matter what happens, if we can. And then you mentioned it yourself, like when you commit to sit for a certain amount of time, then just do it.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you strike this balance, like in recognizing the difference between your meditation is just going to hell and you just do a dedication and end, versus no, I'm going to power through this. I'm going to sit with all this freneticness, discomfort, anxiety, whatever.
Yeah. And it's a great question. And it's going to be very personal for everybody. But I would point back to the window of tolerance. Like, I think that for me is the test. And as I said, like that has honestly, like, to be honest, that saved meditation for me. Like there was a while where I couldn't do it anymore. And I know people who can't, like it's just for whatever reason, meditation is not for them. It's a not insignificant number of people. That it's amazing if you look at some of the research on this, and there's not a lot of it because most people who try to study meditation and mindfulness scientifically are people who want to show you how awesome it is. And I think it's awesome too. Don't get me wrong. But clearly, right? But at the same time, like I think pharmaceuticals are awesome too. But I also think it's a good idea we give a list of all the things that could go wrong, and how to know if things are going wrong and when to reach out to your doctor. And so when you look at the research for this stuff, like it's interesting because if you just ask people, have you had an adverse effect? Like you get a very small amount of people who say yes. But if you give people a list of adverse effects, that number jumps up to like 50%. And then some of those things, really the top line number is 1 in 10 people have adverse effects, up to and including functional impairment of a month or more. And this, I mention my friends in the Cheetah House community often in these meetings because they're wonderful people, and what's funny to me about it is I feel like they are better. I was about to say better meditators, but I feel like they have a better grasp of Dharma than many of us do in the Buddhist community because they are so aware and they've learned how to monitor their regulation, like how they're doing, the window of tolerance kind of thing. They're so aware of when a thing is taking them down a negative path versus when a thing is taking them down a path that is meritorious or beneficial. And it's funny because like in a way, like I feel like my language for it is they are super mindful people. They've become more mindful through their experience. A lot of them would not want to hear that, and they don't even want to hear the words mindfulness or meditation. But that doesn't matter. Like it's just it's all relative. But in any case, I think that the window of tolerance is a great way to check in and see, like if I'm feeling super agitated, like I think the flaw is we usually will just call it a thing. So we'll say like, oh, I'm stressed out, or oh, I'm spacey. But the idea is no. There's a whole lot of nuance there. Like Yeah, you're spacey. Are you like just a little spacey? Are you a lot spacey? Are you so spacey that this session is not going to be productive? You know, and it could potentially like really hurt you. You know, like we don't talk about that as much in Buddhist communities, but that's one of the reasons why I talk about it so much. Is I think it needs to be there, and it's in the tantric texts too. You know, like there's all kinds of they talk about wind disorder, and it's just
Yeah,
not as we
yeah,
don't talk about it as much. But yeah, I would say window of tolerance, but I would also say like, you know, another way to frame that is note if the reason you are considering stopping your practice has to do with your comfort. Like, am I doing this because this is uncomfortable, or I'm doing this because I am actually overwhelmed, you know?
yeah. And also, right, the difference between being being hooked by one of the eight worldly concerns
Ooh, that's great.
rather than just your body says, I need a break, right? There's a
That's
difference.
a great one.
Oh, I got to go get a
Yeah.
coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Is my back's hurting. I need to rest.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great example. Yeah.
But you know, one of the
And
things, like
mhm.
Pamela and I went on vacation to Hawaii once, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to see if there's any Dharma centers nearby." And I found a Zen center that was not far from where we were staying. And I'm looking at their schedule and it says, 2 hours sitting, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Zazen, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they just sit there for 2 hours and stare at the wall. Wow, I couldn't do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, you know, I think back to there was a time in retreat, and I won't name names, but there was a time in retreat where I was sitting and one of the like higher up teachers was there, and it was a long puja. I think it was like one of the 3 hour mahakalas, and I've had issues like with my hip, particularly since retreat and sitting so much. And there was a point where I tried to sit as long as I could, but I needed to move, you know. And this Lama was like, "No, stay." And he like put his hand on my knee, and I trusted them. And I looked back on that moment and realized I shouldn't have, because I knew in that moment I was sure that I needed to move my leg, and I stayed, and it ended up like caught making things way worse for another 3 or 4 weeks after that. And I don't think there was any ill will there. I know they were
Sure,
trying to help me, but
sure.
I should have listened to myself there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the really dharmas. That's a great way to think about it too. Um,
Yeah,
Lisa?
I had a question. So it
Mhm.
doesn't, so you don't have to be like to attain enlightenment, do you have to be able to meditate for hours and hours, or that's not how it works?
That's interesting. Yeah,
A dumb
but
question.
there's a
But
couple pieces there. Like, yeah, go ahead. What were you
yeah.
gonna say?
Oh no, go ahead.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I like to, I personally, although there's definitely two ways of thinking about this, but I really like to think about enlightenment as being something that I'm going to make more and more frequent in my life, as opposed to like the final destination. Although both of those views are valid. Um, but you know, I'm working. We're working through this Ken Holmes Karmakagi study course now with Lama Kathy and a group, and you know, one of the things he points out in there is, and he says many teachers have said this, that there are a lot of people who are not Buddhist but live lives that accord with the Dharma, and there's actually a name for them, which is natural Buddhists. You know, so I don't think that. I mean, to answer your question from my view, no. Like, I don't think it's necessary. You know, like I feel like if you can, and that's what a person needs to remedy their ego clinging, because again, all Dharma is remedy for ego clinging. So if that's what's needed, um, then I think that makes sense. But I would not by any means say that that's something you have to be able to do for a long time or every day. Or I think it's far more important that you're able to apply that stuff in daily life, that if more and more frequently the slogans come to mind, or more and more frequently you see um, kleshas coming up and take them as a reminder to practice mindfulness. You know, I think that's really the key. And you know, it's funny, like there's only like a handful of sutras that even mention meditation. that the Buddha taught. So like, I know there's been a lot that's happened since then, and there's the view that the Buddha taught, that secretly taught the Vajrayana and all those kind of things, if you subscribe to that. But I feel like my personal view is there's Dharma, and then the Buddha discovered it and taught it and was awesome at it, and we're all grateful. And then there have been many other teachers who have been able to teach methods of revealing truth and Dharma as well. So I think that I'm sure there are people who never learned to meditate but are way more enlightened than me. I meet them all the time, to be honest.
Yeah, true.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also the question of like, what is meditation? Meditation is such a funny thing because we've so formalized it in our tradition into like a thing we do that has instructions and but like I know I've mentioned here before, like the meaning is to like familiarize yourself. But another thing that's interesting about it, Carl Brunholz pointed out that the I don't know exactly what the word for it is in grammar, but the word for it actually doesn't indicate a verb that somebody does. It's just a thing that happens. So like rain, like rain is a verb, but nobody is raining, and like meditation is like that. So it's not even really a thing that we have to do. And if we are, we're probably not actually doing it totally correctly anyway. Like a lot of what we call meditation and we train in is like the training wheels for real meditation, which is life,
Right.
Lisa, I want to add that I've heard some people too, if they're just seem too overly can't sit much, that they can do mantras too, and that's a form of meditation, but you don't have to be sitting there on the cushion motionless.
Right, exactly. Because like if you're lying in bed and you're not really thinking of anything, but you're trying to say mantras, that I don't want to misuse time like that if I'm already like in bed and I can't sleep. Does that make sense? Like kind of use that time as a kind of meditation, but I'm already trying to go to sleep. So I'm already laying down. So I'm not like in a meditation position.
Oh yeah. I think I would say I totally think almost any technique that you would ever do in a formal practice, you can and should apply it in every other circumstance. But with the understanding that it's not going to be the same. And what I mean by that is like, what makes formal practice important is it isolates the skill. And when we start to take that into other settings, there's all these other variables that come in. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying, Now, the sleep thing's an interesting one, right? Because like there is teachings that we should say mantras before sleep. And then if we wake up saying them, it's like our sleep is blessed. I can tell you for me, like that keeps me awake. Like if I try to do that, I can't fall asleep. So, and I know I need sleep if I want to be kind to people. So,
right.
Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry.
Thank you.
This conversation is very interesting because I go through cycles. Like I think March and April, every day I set my alarm for 3 a.m. and I was on my cushion by 4, and I would do practice from 4 to 8 o'clock, without a break other than getting up to bring some water and another cup of coffee, to where I'm sitting. But and I found it was invaluable. But then I get to a point where I'm like, I really feel the benefits of doing that discipline to practice, and I was doing every night of the week except for Tuesday, like Zooming with you, doing Zooms for Guru Rinpoche Day, POA, new moon, full moon, uh, you know, Tars, Dakini Day soak, like observing everything. And I love it. I really do. Like I made that my organizing principle because samsara is just, pardon my language, it's just a shit show, and it's always going to try and interrupt your practice. And so anyhow, then I get to a point where I am so exhausted, and like you, my back is hurting, my ankles are hurting. And now my thing is that I don't mean to. I fall asleep at like 7:30 at night, and then I'm up at 11:30. And then I lay down and I do mantras because the Sakya Trinzen said we should do Amitabha every night before we go to sleep, like 108 a day, and we will have a long life. And so, we need a long life to do all the practices we need to do. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
saying that tongue in cheek, but we probably need many lives to get enlightened. But then my question to you is, am I undisciplined that I get on this track? Oh, and I did like a Nunye retreat, a Red Tara retreat, you know, and I
So
do.
are you undisciplined because of going to sleep earlier, you asking?
No, nothing to do with my sleep, because I get to a point where just me, I get fatigued. I do have an autoimmune disorder, and it kicks in unexpectedly. And then that
Hmm.
rigor with which I have, my timer on and my alarms and all my texts in front of me. And, you know,
Hmm.
I do this whole schedule around the context of practice. For example, I do White Tara practice every morning. That's my 7 to 8 thing, and Chenrez's Eve practice at 5. Like I really, everything else I have to get in before that. So
Yeah, yeah.
I feel
I
like
think.
I feel
Mhm.
like I'm behind on a lot of mundane chores, but I feel like this is enriching. But then I do get fatigued and exhausted where, you know, like I was supposed to be in my shrink group last night for 3 years, a group of other women psychologists
Mhm.
and myself have been meeting every Tuesday night from 7:30 to 9. And I laid down at 7 and I put my alarm on because my eyes were tired, and I thought just, and my back was hurting because I did like, you know, uh, a lot of physical stuff, a jiu-jitsu class yesterday and yoga.
Mhm.
Anyway, um, my question, I'm sorry I'm like so all over the place, is what do you do? Like I feel bad when I'm too tired to do what I had committed to doing, I think is the question. How do you work around that? Like I
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I mean, I think it will always find us on one end or the other. I think like this is one of those balancing situations where we're either going to find out that we've pushed a little bit too far towards, like, to put it in the Buddha's life story model. We've gone a little bit too far to the ascetic side of things. We're a little bit too disciplined, a little bit too committed, and it's fatiguing us, like you said, or it's causing us maybe extra anxiety. And I think that one thing to recall is part of the reason why we talk about being Buddha, and our nature
mm-hmm,
being Buddha,
mm-hmm.
being awake, is because like that's something we can rely on too. It can be abused. We can use that as a reason to be lazy, like I don't need to practice, I'm Buddha. But like but I think it is valid sometimes. Like sometimes we are too tired to do a formal practice, and we can just lay and look at the ceiling, and there's, I think it's totally valid to take some time to check in,
But
see,
it's
are you outside the window or not,
mm-hmm.
and then make a choice, really make your choice based on that.
But it's more than that, Adam, because it's like a lifestyle. And what I'm realizing is I don't really have time for friendship to see friends. I'm lucky I can fit in walking my dog 3 times a day, taking care of my cat, paying bills, doing laundry, and the mundane stuff that we need to do to have,
Yeah.
a reasonable level of comfort and security. And so I want, part of me thinks, well, maybe I'm doing all of this just to be a hermit and withdraw. Maybe I'm doing this to avoid closeness and intimacy. I don't think
Yeah.
so, but then I go there, but I get so confused with my
Well,
own obscurations because you can't fit
yeah.
everything in. And if you do, for me, if I don't make practice my priority, especially at this stage of my life, being
Mhm.
I never thought I'd proudly refer to myself as a senior citizen, but I am, and with
Well,
what's going on in the world, like it could blow up tomorrow and we have to be prepared if we don't want to return to samsara.
true, true. Well, I would say, and then I think we have to wrap up for the night. I would just say that, like, I think it's good to remember the distinction between Dharma and Buddhism. And what I mean
Mm-hmm.
by that is that, like, all of the trappings of Buddhism are all meant as ways of revealing the truth. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are times where we can just be who we are, be ourselves. There are times where we can fulfill our needs, even if they're comfort oriented needs. And I think, again, back to the other side, if you've got the ascetic part of the Buddha's life and the luxury part, like, we need to know which of those we need at a given point in time. And I mean, not every teacher will say this, but I don't think you have to do every practice every day without fail. Like, I think there are days where you may find you can't or you shouldn't. And I think that needs to be honored, with the caveat that most of us need to push ourselves a little more than we already are. And I think that's why we hear teachings like always do this and, don't ever not do that. So I think those are super important teachings, but I think the point of that is to counterbalance laziness. And if laziness is not the issue, then sometimes laziness is the answer, you know.
Thank you so much
And I
for all
yeah.
that. Awesome. Thank you. I know I want to let
Yeah,
you
thank you.
go because it's late your time and you've given
That's okay. I love it.
so generous with your time. We really, really appreciate it.
I just wanted to say one last thing. Today I had to go out in the world and I enjoyed it because everything was like a movie and it reflected, like if someone hit me in the ass with a shopping cart, was I nasty or did I just take it in stride? Like it's a test when you go
Hmm.
out there. And it's amusing and there are nice moments with strangers as you go through your day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you
And I
very
know we have
much.
to do our prayer of dedication before we go. And I would also encourage you, when you do a dedication like this, to think about the intention and that mechanism of practical and precise and broad and altruistic in terms of your dedication as well. Because I feel like, and this is putting together a little bit of science with a little bit of Buddhism, but like, I don't want to just dedicate the merit and then move on. I want to kind of like a new rebirth. Like, when I sit down to practice, I set an intention. Like, this is what I want from this session. And I don't just always say, like, I want to achieve the six perfections. I'll say, wow, I'm feeling a little anxious today, so I'm hoping in this session that I will balance out a little bit, because I know that's how I can benefit all beings. So I'm getting clear on a very personal and today oriented intention, and then I put that in the wrapping of the refuge prayer. And same thing with the dedication. Like, I feel like I don't want that to just be like the end and I'm closing. It's kind of like why I try not to say post meditation and I say applied practice, because that ending of your formal practice is the beginning of your applied practice. And applied practice is way harder, right? So, like, if we need intention when we sit down for our formal practice, we definitely need it for when we set off on our applied practice. So, like, I would encourage you, we'll say the prayer, but before we do that, I would like you to just take a second and think about anything that resonated with you tonight, or something maybe that you want to contemplate more. But I would say take a second and make a practical intention for what you want to do with that tomorrow. Like
I
we could
love
say tonight
that.
because it's earlier there. So think
That is,
about what you
tonight
want to
is a
do.
great teaching.
Yes,
This is
thank you. So think about that for tomorrow, like what you're going to do with what you learned tonight, and then put that in the broader altruistic wrapper. And so I'll be quiet for just a moment, and then I'll put the dedications so that you can think about that. And then I'll put the dedication on the screen, and we can say that together. Okay. By this merit, may all beings obtain the omniscience of Buddhahood and defeat our common enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, may we free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything as it is, Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way, and also all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow in their path, I completely dedicate all this virtue. Okay.
Thank you, Lama.
So great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next month. Thank you for a beautiful teaching. Thanks
Thank you,
Thank you.
Lama Adam.
for being
Take
here.
care.
Good
Be
night.
well.